Hello and welcome to Future Procurement. My name is Robert Freeman and I'm super excited now to talk to Margaret Gilbert again. Hello Margaret.
Hello there.
These 2 weeks it was a heavy traveling for me, and I was meeting two business partners in Italy, and we have developed a good long-term directions with them for their procurement departments. Really challenging situations they had, and the most difficult honestly was when we are facing the short-term problems, we are not becoming only the firefighters, what I called firefighter brigade to them. They were laughing, and I said to them, and we agreed in the end with the CPOs of both companies actually, who had really big procurement problems here and now. In the end, we were really concentrating on procurement strategy exactly after the moment when we understood what to do with these particular problems that they had here and now. So what we agreed in the end, that when procurement department is facing a big short-term problems, think about your strategy. And actually this topic would be the topic of today with you, Margaret. And if you can elaborate in our new format, in our new way of presenting materials, and which you are doing really great.
Thank you.
Yes. So if we can dive deeper into the question of procurement strategy.
Sure, happy to do that. So your comments that you've just made are interesting, because isn't it interesting that sometimes procurement strategy only gets talked about in a hurried way and a hurried manner, exactly. And often when there is a bit of a crisis. But don't you think it would be better to have a procurement strategy that is well thought out? Exactly. And that looks not past the short term, but looks into the medium term and looks into the long term. And medium term, let's just say 2 years, and the long term 4 or 5 years. Let's just say that. And everyone thinks that, yes, we should have a procurement strategy, but then they don't sort of take it to the next level. Yeah. So the title for today's session is Developing a Procurement Strategy. So I've got about 9 points here that I think would be useful to go through, and the concept really is, and I'm sure you would agree, that you actually need to work out where you currently are when it comes to procurement.
Absolutely.
What is your current situation, and even more importantly, where do you want to be, or where do you need to be? Yeah. And then you can decide how to get from A to B, so to speak, from where you are now to where you want to be. So you actually have to plan for that. And the other concept is, in terms of a procurement strategy, you just can't create something that's independent of the organisation. You really need to make sure that it fits into the organisational strategy, because you don't want the two being out of whack with each other, out of alignment with each other. And sometimes it's interesting because, you think that you can cover off the first point or the second point very quickly, but sometimes if you don't know where your procurement is now, and there are some instances out there that people don't, then you really got to have some kind of a baseline, don't you? And to have a baseline is helpful for where you are now versus, as I said, where you want to be, and to sort of see, well, the means of getting there. So if you don't have a baseline, that's a bit of a worry. And I can give you a little bit of a story, because I was speaking to somebody earlier in the week when I was visiting and working with in New Zealand. And it's a big organisation, and they don't know what their procurement spend is on any given year. Wow. Now, if you don't know the basics of what your spend is, or then really that's a really sort of basics, the thing that you would think that you would know. So sometimes you've got to start at a really basic kind of a level, and how frustrating is that? We often think that big organisations have got it sorted, but that's not the case, I've found. Okay. And sometimes the small guys, the smaller entities, probably they're not perfect, but sometimes they got a better idea of where their procurement is at.
That is exactly what happened during these visits.
Yes.
To my partners. And when I asked them in this crisis time, let's use your procurement strategy to take the decision, as I call it, like, where is our guidance star? Where are you heading in this or that question? And they were like, we don't have it actually. That's why it was critical to deliver one, because of course I fully agree with you that you should really think about that when the time is good, not to jump into that when you have a crisis situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it's a case of sort of looking at other aspects as well. I mean, what resources are you going to need? Do you have the budget for this? Are there any training requirements or implementation issues that you need to take account of? You can't just wake up one morning and go, okay, we're going to do this and expect it to go particularly well. So you actually need to be really clear about where you want your procurement to go. Get away from this business as usual kind of stuff, which is important because that has to happen, but to equally sort of take a look around and sort of say, okay, we would like to think that in 3 years we can achieve A, B, and C, and in 5 years we can achieve A, B, and C. As I said, sometimes you need to take a long-term view and to be able to communicate that to the organisation so that you can bring them along at the same time. Because you just can't operate in isolation. And the other interesting conversation I've had this week that's relevant for this topic is, they've done all the internal stuff, which is great, and we're going to do this and we're going to do that and da-da-da, which is great. However, they hadn't got around yet to talking to their suppliers to see whether they were capable of coming along with them.
Okay.
So you've got to include both sides in your strategy, both within your own organisation as well as taking account of available suppliers and whether your existing suppliers can work with you. And if they can, that's great. But if they can't, what then? So maybe you might need new suppliers. But of course, to find them might take a little bit of time. So remember, we're talking about a strategy here that's sort of looking for the first year, looking for the next 3 and then 5 years, right? So you need to be able to work out what you need and want and be able to plan for it and to be able to put it into some kind of order. But of course, you also have to remember that sometimes a procurement strategy has to be signed off by somebody, probably immediate management and sometimes way up to board or management level. And they will probably want to have a say in it as well, because that's what management does, right? They like to have their comment and like to sort of say, well, that looks okay, but, or They could say, this is great, let's do it. Yeah. So it's not just a procurement thing; it's an organisational thing. So the upcoming issues can be financial, our resources. Politics with a small p or maybe a capital P, depending on the complexity of it all. And there is going to be you're going to have to achieve buy-in by the rest of the organisation, certainly management, but sometimes equally ordinary workers who probably need to be informed, and so it's just not imposed on them, and then they don't buy in on this and don't follow what's required. So it's quite comprehensive.
It is. And I had one clarifying question maybe. How should you make sure that your procurement strategy is aligned with the strategy of entire company?
Right.
Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. Well, usually an organisation has its strategy, and that's often in an annual plan or something like that, or or communicated or on the website or something like that, and communicated from management down. Well, that's the way it happens in my neck of the woods. And so therefore, the procurement people should really be just sort of just ensuring that your procurement strategy is following the organisational strategy, especially in terms of perhaps requirements that they're going to need to be able to fulfil the organisational strategy.
So good to have this alignment from the very beginning. Otherwise, it can be just work done.
Well, you can waste an awful lot of time.
Exactly.
And then find you're not in alignment, and then your management's going, well, actually, that's not the way we're going at all. Did you not pay attention? Or, so then you might have to start all over again. So you might as well save yourself some time and just make sure that you're on the right track. Or put together a first draft and send it to your management and say, does this look okay to you? Can we continue, putting more detail around it?
Okay, so I think here we have touched a little bit of this, what we call best practice. So maybe until now, if you can summarize what were the most important things.
Okay. Best practice is basically knowing where you are, knowing where you want to be, and knowing why you're doing this, and linking to the organisational strategy. You don't have to follow it exactly, but at least you've got some concept about, where the organisation is going. And then to put together a draft strategy, provide to your management, with high or low management, doesn't matter too much, because your management is probably going to pass it along further up the line anyway. And then it wouldn't hurt to have conversations with relevant, I hate this word, but stakeholders within the organisation. That's a horrible word, I got to say. And get their input, because let's face it, no one knows everything. So it's always a good idea to get input from relevant stakeholders so that they can help you later in terms of promoting that strategy. And if you got a direction that you think that you know, but you're not quite sure how to get there, then that's when you should start talking to your suppliers. And of course, if you've got a good relationship with your suppliers, then have a conversation. It only needs to be that, and get their input so that it makes it easier for you to complete your strategy. Yeah. Now, on previous podcasts, we've been talking a bit about relationship stuff and talking with your suppliers and input, etc. And so from the very first podcast that we did, we talked about the buyer-supplier relationship, and now you can see the benefits of having a positive buyer-supplier relationship, so that you can have a conversation with them to help you with your procurement strategy. And if we switch this around from the supplier side of things, of course, they should be having their own procurement strategy too.
Okay.
But often don't, because they're reactive. But we can't blame that all on suppliers, because if we think about it, is that buyers and being into the business as usual, they can be quite reactive rather than proactive on this sort of stuff too. Yeah. So another best practice is to be proactive.
And also, if you share your strategy with suppliers in some way, it can be, of course, not by just sending the document that you have, internal documents or whatever, but having some sort of introduction to your strategy, or just sharing the things you can share, respecting all confidentiality, etc. I think, and this is actually what we faced in this trip to Italy with my partners. We faced that if we would be transparent enough with their suppliers, then they would be more ready to respond to the challenges that they had.
That's right.
More proactively. So
yes, because you can have a great strategy, but if you don't have suppliers who can work with you or move with you in the direction you want, then you're going to have to spend a bit of time finding suppliers who will.
Right.
And then you get into the issues about, either terminating contracts or waiting until the contract is due for, renegotiation or rebidding or whatever the case may be. So that might take a little bit of time. But I think suppliers, I've found over the years, is that if you involve them, you sort of say, this is the vision, this is what we want to do, they're quite happy to move with you and work with you. And that's why you want innovative suppliers, right? So that they can think bigger and more strategically. because that's what a procurement strategy needs, is that you're going to need to be able to think strategically as to how best we can do this for the organisation, how best we can make procurement for what we need. And that's why one of my points there is that you actually have to ask questions. If you just assume you know it all, then that becomes very inward looking, and that's not great. You need input from various sectors, back to your stakeholders again, or your suppliers, and ask questions, because you might not know all the answers, but if you ask some questions, that can provide linkages and sort of trigger some thoughts, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And then, therefore, possible solutions can come from asking those questions. And it could be that you actually think you know, but by talking to the supplier, they say, "Oh no, don't. If you do it that way, that's fine. But if you do it this way, then you can achieve what you're trying to do."
Exactly.
Yeah, you've got to there has to be an element of trust here. And we've talked about this in other podcasts, haven't we? That you actually need to trust your supplier, and to be able to have a conversation or conversations, and to work through it. And to be honest, if I had a procurement strategy, I'd be quite happy to provide it to the supplier, especially the ones that you need to bring along with you, and give it to them and say, "Hey, this is what we're looking at doing. Give us some feedback. Can we do it better?" It's not just a one-person thing going on here. It shouldn't be anyway.
Yeah, and by this you will also be able to encourage them to provide some, as you said, to provide some feedback, and by this you use their expertise, their knowledge of the market, because you are not the only customer maybe for them, and probably normally you have a diversified portfolio at suppliers who can also observe what's going on with the other companies, where is the direction for them. So of course it's a crime, or it's a sin, not to use this expertise and their experience in this product or service they're providing.
Yeah, because it's a bit arrogant to think from the buyer side, is to think that we're the only people who want to do this and whatever, without realising that the supplier has probably done the same sort of thing for many other buyers. So you might as well tap into the resource and the expertise. Make your life easier.
Good.
And one of the other things about best practice here is, as the question is, why do you start, and when do you start, and why? And at the beginning of this podcast that we're doing now, is that you said that these people in Italy who are meeting were really leaving it to the real last minute. So the whole thing about procurement, if we're thinking about it from best practice, is to plan early, start early, do so before you have to, have some time up your sleeve, so to speak, and work towards, achieving best procurement across short-term, medium-term and long-term. And some people say to me, well, okay, we've got it short-term and whatever, why do we need to worry about long-term? Well, the answer to that is that sometimes if it's quite a significant procurement that you're thinking about, you actually have to do the thinking about what you need. You probably have to budget for it, and it could be that it has to go over more than one financial year.
Exactly.
So, you can't just spring a surprise on your management by saying, okay, we need to do this now, so to speak, if everyone is not ready for it to happen. Which is why you probably need to have a bit of an implementation plan and possibly a training plan if necessary, if it's going to take a training session with your internal people.
How to really make sure that you implement it in a good way? Do you have advice here?
Well, there's two ways. I can give you the good way and the bad way. The bad way first. The bad way is just to sort of plonk it down one day and say, okay, this is it, without referring to anybody, without undertaking any training if necessary, without getting people's buy-in, without talking to stakeholders who'll get their nose out of joint, so to speak, and then will say, well, why weren't we consulted? And it will go absolutely nowhere. So the good way, the positive way, is to involve all the relevant parties early. Now, some of those people have just got a minor interest. Some of them have got a major interest. Some of them have got a funding component to it. So it's always a good idea to involve those guys. Now, they might not necessarily have the total procurement expertise and are just relying on you to be able to sort of flesh it out, if that's the right word, from the concept. Yeah, so it's really a matter of involving. Nice. And if in fact you actually talk to your suppliers who can then provide you perhaps with a better solution. So when management starts saying, are we sure this is the right way, you can go, well, actually, we've had initial conversations and they've given us a better way of doing this, and this is what it is. Then management will feel better that they've, that it's not just one coming out of one person's head.
It's very good. So involved from early stages, even
early stages.
Sometimes I remember we were doing this even before we started to work. We were informing the organization that we start to work with a proper procurement strategy in time when we didn't have any, for example.
Yes.
That was also to give people the awareness, the general awareness that this is gonna happen.
Yes.
And, but honestly, I have also done like you described in the bad way. And I remember It was a disaster.
The other thing about a procurement strategy is that some people seem to think that it has to be the size of a phone book, although I shouldn't say that these days because sometimes, too many phone books around anymore. No. But you know what I'm saying.
But tell the best practice. Well, how big it should be, and maybe some typical chapters or parts that you must include.
Right. Each procurement strategy has to be specific to the situation and different. So it's not like I can give you a template and say, here it is. But it has to be relevant. So it could be in some circumstances, let's just say an example, 10 pages is sufficient.
Yeah.
And some people sort of think it has to be sort of like 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 pages. No one's going to pay attention to it if it's 100 pages, frankly. I mean, if you look between 10 and 30 odd pages for a strategy, especially if it's going to include short-term, long-term, medium-term and long-term, then, you could almost divide it between 10 pages for each, so to speak. Okay. And it's going to basically need to have a bit like a business case in some ways, a current, an introduction, a current situation, the direction you want to go in, budget requirements, time frame, implementation, the issues, benefits, negatives, a bit like a business case, as I said.
Nice. Good advice.
Yeah.
Good comparison.
And because management might not want to read 30 pages or 40 pages, 50 pages, it would be a good idea to have an executive summary at the beginning.
Exactly.
So if they just read the bullet points and the main points, then that probably will be sufficient for them. Yep.
My last practice that I started to do a few years ago was that I tried to put everything up to one PowerPoint slide where you put together all the basic principles and maybe some key elements if there is KPI or if there is like a keyword or something like this or many of them, and try to visualize but really make it one page.
Yes.
Of course, it should be a full document behind it, of course. But how to visualize, and this to help all people in your organization to buy it in, and you put it on the presentation from time to time when you present. So as it is stated in our procurement strategy, and you show this on your slide and put, here is a block that we were talking about. Okay.
Yes.
So from time to time you will also be able to connect people to this strategy, and showing by this that yes, we have a strategy and yes, we follow it. So just keep also one short version, maybe one PowerPoint page.
Yes, and the other thing is that organisations have regular meetings, whether it's just a finance meeting or a whatever type meeting, and you can get yourself invited along and just keep people updated as to where things are at. And one of those stakeholders is the reason I mentioned finance, because one of the stakeholders is likely to be finance, because you're going to need to get money from the organisation, aren't you? So, it's going to have to be a budget scenario, and sort of whether that can be approved or whether they're going to look at you saying, well, we can't afford this sort of thing.
Exactly.
And to include your management as well as, other relevant parts of the organisation, the techie people and maybe IT. So you just can't do it in an isolated manner.
Mm.
And when I do procurement strategies for my clients, I actually sort of say, okay, these are the issues. We know these are your issues, or this is what you need to think about. But I find it's not always helpful just to sort of say this is your problem or this is the issue, because my clients then look at me and go, okay, but I don't know how to solve the problem. So in some ways with a strategy, it's a good idea to be able to sort of say, okay, this is the issue. And the ways of what you need to do are, and 3 ways of being able to implement are 1, 2, and 3, so that there is some clarity not only about what the issue is, but equally how to solve the issue.
Mm.
And if you're going to talk to your suppliers and they can provide you a solution, you can attach that within the document as well.
Margaret, this leads me to a question, actually. And this is always a dilemma for me about being too detailed and being too general for strategy. How do you deal with that? Because what you say maybe, how much should you say how to do? Or saying what to do still gives a lot of choice. But saying how to do is kind of limiting. How to deal with this dilemma? I
think we've got to be careful because, if you fill it full of words and then your key messages get lost. So some bullet point stuff or getting your key messages in there and very easily and perhaps into your executive summary as well will take you a long way. You don't want to provide minute detail because management won't care. They just want to know the concept and that it's easily done and got the budget for it, and yes, we need, and it's going to take a bit of time to implement and all the rest of it. That's what they want to hear.
Okay. Because
they don't want to know every little thing about procurement, frankly, because they got so much going on in their brain on other parts of the organisation. They're not going to, they're relying on you for you being the expert.
Exactly.
And maybe a short version and a longer version wouldn't go amiss, just in case there's one of those management types who want to see all the detail. And the other thing is, from a best practice perspective, is that when you've got this sorted and done and you think you're right, is perhaps you can sort of do a presentation to your management. And so that they can ask questions and all the rest of it. So, and that is useful for you because if there's something that you've missed or something that they are just thinking about for the organisation totally, at least you'll probably be informed. And so therefore you might have to go back and sort of tinker with it, with the strategy to align it again, as I said, so that you're not sort of missing a piece, so to speak. And the other thing from a best practice perspective is that once you've got your strategy, it should be a living document.
Yeah.
It's not a case of sort of, you've got it, so therefore, and then you merrily carry on because, things can change 6 months, 12 months, whatever. And it could be that you need to update it, revise it, whatever, and keep it updated. Mm. And some people seem to think that, yes, they can tick a box and say, okay, we've got a strategy or a policy or whatever, procedures, whatever, and then it's left for years. And that's just a waste of time.
I agree here fully. And for some people it feels difficult. For me, for example, in the beginning it felt difficult when you make a strategy and you change it in, I don't know, half year or in 1 year because of some circumstances or some preconditions have changed. And I had the internal struggle in the beginning. Now I think it's just good, like if things change, because things normally change, you change it. But of course you shouldn't have a new direction every year. Then you are really. But some guiding stars, as I call them, some few points or one big point where you are heading should remain there, if not forever, then for a really long time, longer than 1 year or so.
Sure. Well, if you've got 10 points under your short term, 10 points under your midterm, and 10 points under your long term, as an example, then it's going to take 6 months to a year to tick off each of those 10 points within your short term, right? And it could be if something is affecting there that can affect the midterm. So you're going to have to from an operational perspective, perhaps change things a little bit. The concept stays the same and not change it year by year, as you say. Because, you never know what's going to happen in the future, and whether it's around, world economics or competition or whatever the case may be, that, you need to be a bit more agile. You can't just stick to a document and say, this is it, absolutely. You've got to be able to adapt and move within that procurement strategy.
Great advice. And
that's good best practice. So, and the other thing, once you've got a procurement strategy, and I know that, we've been talking about the need to talk with others and stuff like that, you need then to get your management to support it, which is why you should be talking to them early, so that they can sort of say to the organisation, this was what the procurement strategy is going forward. So they promote it for you. They are being a procurement champion for you, in effect. Yeah. Otherwise, it will just sit and nothing happens. So you need to get your immediate management or your top management, whatever, to promote through regular meetings or through the intranet or notice boards or whatever the case may be. And that just shows the organisation that procurement is adding value. And we talked about that in other podcasts, haven't we? Yeah. So if all people are aware of the strategy, and that would be helpful, because that stops people coming along and say, I want this today, when we all know as procurement people it's going to take 3 months to go through a tender process. So is there a one size fits all when it comes to a procurement strategy? The answer is no, and it shouldn't be. It should be fit for purpose, using good old procurement words here, fit for purpose, but there is no one size fits all, because all organisations are different. They're large and small, etc. Is a procurement strategy necessary for a smaller organisation as for a large one? The answer, I would think, is yes.
Absolutely. Maybe even more, actually. In some cases, yeah. I see that it's even more.
Flying blind is not a good way to do procurement, and being proactive is a better way to go. And if you've got a definite direction going forward, that makes your business as usual stuff easier, because your strategy flows into your day-to-day.
Good summary and good statement.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for being with us in this episode of Future Procurement till the very end. I really hope that the best practice of developing and implementing the procurement strategy that Margaret was sharing with us was useful for you, and you will start to implement the advice and the hints shared by Margaret into your company, into your procurement organization. From my side, I would like to provide some guidelines for developing and implementing your procurement strategy. I have prepared the link in the show notes to this episode, where you can download some visual materials that will guide you or help you to develop your procurement strategy. As always, please leave the comment, rate and review our podcast wherever you listen to, and share it with your friends and colleagues, so that as many people as possible will know about this podcast. We will continue to provide best practice of procurement to you every second week, so subscribe to the podcast in order not to miss another episode. My name is Robert Freeman, and this was Future Procurement Podcast. Talk to you soon.